It's a real pleasure to be here this evening with you all. And as Father Seamus said, I work in the tribunal. And so a big part of my job is dealing with marriage nullity cases, sometimes what we call annulments. So people who are, hoping to get married in the church, but they've been previously married and divorced, and they're looking to marry again. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we come along here. But just know, that's going to maybe shape in a way how I convey some of the information. One of my colleagues who's actually no longer with the tribunal anymore, he moved on for further studies. He went back to school. But he used to say, when people asked him what he did, he said, "I do autopsies of dead marriages." So I'm going to have a certain perspective on things that might be a little different than if someone else were, trying to talk about this. So, I just have to remind myself that I want to talk about marriages that are living and doing well here. So marriage is one of the 7 sacraments of the church. And I know you've done already a lot with this, but, sacrament can be described, as the Baltimore Catechism says, as an outward sign instituted by Christ to give grace. Sacraments are signs and means by which faith is expressed and strengthened, worship is offered to God, and our sanctification is brought about. And so sacraments are, it's really what's kind of called the validity of the sacraments, that's determined by the supreme authority of the church. So it really comes to the Pope, it comes to his office to define what's needed for a marriage. So so when it comes to all of the sacraments, they've been defined in certainly the church's tradition and what Christ gave us. But, in some of the sacraments where it's a little complicated, like holy orders, the supreme authority of the church has said it's necessary for an ordination to happen, the laying of hands has to happen, and a prayer of consecration has to be said for that man to, say, become a deacon or a priest or bishop. So marriage, though, is interesting because it's a sacrament, but it also isn't always a sacrament. There are a lot of Catholics who are married today who are in non-sacramental marriages. Kind of weird, right? Because we always think of marriage as being one of the 7 sacraments. It is one of the 7 sacraments, but not every marriage is a sacramental marriage. So how can that be? So marriage is, it's a natural institution. It's not something that just came about when Christianity came about. People have been, getting married for a long time, having children and all that. But what our Lord has done, and we'll get into this a little more as we go along, is he's raised up for the baptized, it has become a sacrament. So, an example of a non-sacramental marriage could be a marriage between, say, 2 Jewish people together. It's still very much a real marriage. It's a real natural marriage, but it's not one of the 7 sacraments because Jewish people are not baptized. A Catholic person can marry, say, a non-baptized person with permission of the church, and might even marry inside a church. Like a Catholic woman could marry a Muslim man, and they could have this marriage. It could be officiated by a priest, it could be in a church, it could be in the cathedral right here, but that marriage is not going to be a sacramental marriage because one of the 2 people getting married is not baptized. So it's kind of so a lot of times marriages can be very much real marriages, but they might not be a sacrament. But so that's one of the things I have here, kind of a quote, because I was just trying to find like a way, well, how do you, so what's the difference between a marriage that's non-sacramental and sacramental? So I went to this professor, late professor, Monsignor Cormac Burke, who had doctorates in theology and canon law. He was a professor and judge in the church's highest court of appeal, the Roman Rota. And he described the difference as this. And so it's talking about what natural marriage or non-sacramental marriage is to sacramental marriage. He said, natural marriage is not a lesser commitment than Christian marriage, one that is less demanding or that its demands are more easily ignored or dispensed with. But natural marriage, we repeat, is in fact as much of a commitment as Christian marriage. The difference is that it is not as enriched. It does not confer sacramentality and faith in the same strength or receive the same help from above to achieve and practice the fulfillment of its promises. Sacramentality is an expression of God's largesse, not of his exigency. It is something that strengthens, remedies, and enriches. In this respect, it imposes no peculiar obligation over and above natural marriage, other perhaps than one of particular gratitude for the calling and unique gifts which it confers. And just actually, before I continue, if anyone has any questions or anything as we go along, feel free to interrupt me if something's unclear. I'm throwing out a lot of unusual language and lingo and stuff, so feel free.
Sorry, I'm not familiar. Are you a lawyer? Did you go to law school? Or are you a canon law lawyer?
Yeah, so I'm a canon lawyer, so the church has its own legal system called canon law, because the church operates everywhere in the world, and so it has its own system for its like internal ordering and everything like that, and it covers everything from, what we're talking about tonight, like about how marriage works, the rules for marriage, to how does a parish get a pastor? How does a parish get a parish council, finance council? Those are all things that are kind of specified by the church's law. So so I am a lawyer of a type, but I'm not a common law lawyer. I'm not a civil attorney. So my law is really specifically for in the Catholic Church. So if I, say if Bishop Dealey decided he no longer wanted my services, I'd be out of a job. I wouldn't be able to necessarily find another law firm in town to work for, because really the church is kind of the only game in town when it comes to canon law. So I'm employed by the diocese here. Yeah, so full time. That makes sense. Any other thoughts or questions about where we are right now? So just talking a little bit about that difference between sacramental marriage and non-sacramental or natural marriage. Sometimes I think that people might think that, well, a natural marriage, must be like a kind of an easier thing or something that doesn't have as many obligations, or for all intents and purposes, marriage is marriage. It's just that by marriage becoming a sacrament among the baptized, the baptized are open to special graces from God to kind of strengthen the people in that marriage, in that commitment. So like there's a kind of a classic expression, that kind of comes from the medieval ages, the scholastics like St. Thomas Aquinas and all of them in that time period. And they talked about grace perfecting nature. So the nature, marriage is a really wonderful, beautiful, great thing. but it's perfected, it's strengthened among the baptized when it becomes a sacrament. So I don't know, I must confess, the exact intricacies of how lived out, how is a sacramental marriage going to be different than a non-sacramental marriage? I'm probably giving you close to the maximum amount of information and insight that I have here, but there is a difference. And that's, I think it's just an important thing, is that sometimes we throw around terms like we try to say like, a marriage in church is a sacramental marriage. We sometimes use it as like a synonym, meaning like the same thing, and that's not always the case. And, and this is something we'll talk a little bit about specifically when we get into canonical form a little later on. But Catholics are obligated to have special requirements when it comes to marriage that the Church does not expect non-Catholics to hold. So for instance, like if two Catholics decide to kind of get married on the beach by a civil notary, that's not going to be a valid marriage. So valid meaning efficacious, meaning it comes from the Latin valeo or valere, to be healthy. So a valid marriage is one that exists in reality. It's a real marriage. It actually exists. So marriage, we believe, and the Church teaches that what makes the marriage is the consent of the couple, like the I do's, like I take you as my wife, I take you as my husband. That makes the marriage, and then once that happens, the people are married. So if two Catholics get married, what we kind of would say outside the Church, and this is like without the permission of the Church, it's not going to be a valid marriage. So it might be a civilly binding marriage. You might be able to get your all the tax benefits from marriage and stuff like that. But in the eyes of the Catholic Church, those two people are not married. But if we have our, say two Episcopalians do the same thing, they decide, they want to get married on the beach by a civil notary, the Catholic Church would look at that and say, okay, well, Episcopalians, they're Christians, so they're baptized Christians. They exchange their consent. The Catholic Church would view that marriage as a valid sacramental marriage. So even though God might not have been mentioned at all, they might have been, who knows, like wearing swimsuits, whatever. This might not be like a very holy looking thing at all, but two Christians exchange vows, get married. That's a valid sacramental marriage. But two Catholics, no. So, and we'll get into a little bit later, like the history of that, like what's going on here with that. But Catholics are obliged to marry in church, and it's called canonical form, in the presence of a priest and two witnesses, or it could be a deacon and two witnesses. And in some places, especially where there's a lack of vocations, there might be a lay officiant who takes the place of the priest or deacon in receiving the vows of the couple in the name of the church. But we'll get a little bit more into that. But just at least for this point here, the important thing is that something can be a sacramental marriage and it might have seemingly nothing to do with God or prayer or the Bible or, a priest or minister or anything. Catholics have this special requirement to follow the Church's marriage rules. but we don't expect non-Catholics to follow that. And with the exception of the Eastern Orthodox also have to be married in their case, they actually have to be married in the presence of a priest. And we would only recognize Orthodox that are either married, say, by us in the Catholic Church, or married in the presence of an Orthodox priest. But that's sort of another kind of a little exception. But in general, even Protestants, whether they get married in their church or not, we recognize their marriage as not only valid, but especially if they're both baptized, would be a sacramental marriage as well. So yeah, I think that the point I'm trying to make here is,
I got all those questions.
yeah, yeah, we'll but you know, sacramental doesn't like equal like in church, and doesn't always equal like, oh, this is real marriage. Because, you know, I think some people kind of have this mistaken impression. So sometimes you'll get people, and I'm sure this has probably happened to Father Seamus, where, you know, you'll have like the Catholic guy coming in, and he has his, you know, soon to be, you know, the bride to be, you know, she's maybe a Protestant. And like, okay, you know, so he asks the questions, you know, sir, have you been married before? No. Then you find out she was married before. Oh, but it was just in Vegas. It didn't count, or something like that. But the thing is that certainly if it was a Catholic doing, you know, a Vegas marriage without any permission from the church, that's going to be, you know, not valid. That's not going to be recognized as a marriage the way the Catholic Church understands marriage, even if it is a civilly binding, valid marriage. But a non-Catholic isn't held to that. So, you know, you could have a non-Catholic who maybe, you know, I got married in Vegas, but, you know, only lasted a couple years, and, you know, it was a stupid decision, and, you know, got divorced and it's over, and, you know, I'm more serious now. But what ends up happening is if that person wants to marry a Catholic, that's when they end up contacting us in the diocese, because that person, even though she's a non-Catholic, she has a prior marriage, she needs to have that marriage investigated by the Catholic tribunal to determine whether that marriage, you know, at least in the eyes of the Catholic Church, was there something missing to make that a fully valid marriage. So I think that's something we'll kind of get into the definition of what is marriage. But any questions on any of this so far, or thoughts? I mean, this is a lot of information. It's
So, my thing is, the marriage have to involve the baptism, have to exist. The baptism.
for it to be a sacramental marriage. So you're only going to have a sacramental marriage if both people are baptized. So what can happen too is you could say let's say like the Catholic man marries the Jewish woman. They get married in the church and everything like that, and it's a valid marriage, but natural marriage. But let's say the Jewish wife decides at some point, well, I'm going to go to RCIA and I'm going to become Catholic and I'm going to get baptized. So once she gets baptized, the marriage, not through anything extra other than her being baptized, becomes a sacramental marriage at that moment. So it's not like they don't have to like repeat their vows or go back down the aisle or anything like that. But it's in that moment, once she's baptized, that the priest pours the water and says, "I baptize you in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit." It like instantly becomes a sacramental marriage at that, but without any extra ceremony or anything. At that, it's already valid. So that's like, it's kind of a different concept. Yeah, so like the validity means, one way of putting, so let's just talking about marriage. is it valid means, did it happen in a way? Did this marriage come into existence the way the Catholic Church understands a marriage? And that would be, this is what we're going to presume if people say their vows. And, like say for Catholics, if they say their vows in front of the priest and at least 2 witnesses, we're going to presume that that's a valid marriage. So validity is one thing. The sacramentality just has to do with whether both people are baptized or not. So it's not possible, say, for 2 Catholics to be in a non-sacramental marriage. It can't happen. Or even 2 Episcopalians to be in a non-sacramental marriage. Marriage among the baptized is always a sacrament.
What about the situation baptized twice during this World War II and when come back to Poland second time? She was widow, but she married again. Twice baptized is still valid or not?
So is it like kind of the situation where she thinks that her husband died, but he didn't? Or
Pass away.
he did pass away. So the thing is that, and this is something we'll kind of get into, but marriage is a permanent commitment. It's a lifelong commitment, but marriage ends with death. So basically, if a woman's husband dies, she's free to marry again. She's no longer married anymore. The marriage is over. So she's able to marry again. She's free to marry, if that makes sense. So that's one of those things, like civil divorce from the perspective of the Catholic Church doesn't end marriage. Death does. Death does end marriage. So you're free to marry. So that will be one of the things we'll do. Like I think that was one of the things I maybe sent to you all that you could look at if you wanted to look at some readings. Before this, there was like this thing, it's like the premarital investigation form. And that's like one of those things. So like the priest, when he meets like a couple that's looking to get married, kind of check all these things. Were you married before? Okay, I was married before, but my husband died, and here's like a copy of the obituary or something like that to kind of show like, okay, he did die. So at that point, the woman is free to enter into marriage again. Does that make sense, or do you kind of
I still...
Does it just not seem to make... Yeah, it seems like you make this commitment.
Yeah, because the twice baptism and political situation, that is happened.
Yeah, because of just because of the complicated realities and things like that. But but the thing that I know that sometimes we're getting a little into the weeds here, but like sometimes there might be like these situations too. Well, what happens? Like, my husband goes off to war. I think he's dead. They tell me he's gone. I think he's gone, so I marry someone else, and then like 5 years later he shows up at the door, right? So that's a hard situation, because obviously that first marriage is still a legally binding, valid marriage. So I mean that's a hard situation. So there's no easy answer. So what do you do at this point? But other than to say like that first marriage is still presumed to be a valid marriage, even though maybe the wife thought he was gone. But any other thoughts or questions? this point.
So what happens when he shows up?
I think that's a hard one. Yeah, it's sort of a hard one. I don't know. I don't think there's a rule book for how you deal with all the situation. Probably, especially if kids have come along from this second, what you thought was a valid marriage, and I think it's a very complicated situation that has to be handled case by case. I don't think you can write a general rule to figure that all out. I think it's what do lawyers sometimes say? Hard cases, make bad law, and it's hard to legislate something that sort of scenario. But canon law does provide if someone is missing for an extended period of time and there's no record of what happened, say especially in war-torn areas, maybe they were never able to find someone. They maybe presumed someone died in the war or something like that. The bishop can actually declare someone as dead. And I think civilly this can happen as well. People can be declared dead by the state, but the bishop can. I don't think this is not something that's happened in the Diocese of Portland, probably very frequently or ever, but the bishop could declare someone presumed dead, and so to make maybe their spouse free to enter marriage in the future. But that's not something that's come across my desk.
So I have a question. You said that marriage, can be end by death. You said.
Yeah, so that's an absolute thing.
So what about adultery?
It's a very good question. So that kind of leads us to the. So I think it was on the first thing on this sheet here, or this sheet. So I kind of put here, because I'm a canon lawyer, I had to put some canons on here. But so this first one is under 1A. It's CA canon 1055, paragraph 1 or section 1, sometimes people say. And this is what defines what marriage is. The matrimonial covenant by which a man and woman establish between themselves a partnership of the whole life, and which is ordered by its nature to the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of offspring, has been raised by Christ the Lord to the dignity of a sacrament between the baptized. And for this reason, a valid matrimonial contract cannot exist between the baptized without it being by that fact a sacrament. So that last line is we already addressed that with, when you have the two people who are baptized, it's going to be a sacrament. If it's a marriage, it's going to be a sacramental marriage. But here, this kind of definition of marriage, these are the sort of things basically that point to the reasons why a marriage might not be, to use the word valid in the eyes of the Catholic Church. So that's what kind of comes when someone comes to the tribunal and said, I would like my previous marriage declared null. I've been divorced for 10 years, and these are the reasons why I think the church should declare my marriage null. They'll kind of point to these sort of things, like marriage is supposed to be an exclusive partnership between the man and the woman. So there's no third person involved. There's no openness to having an open relationship. This is an exclusive commitment between the man and the woman. If someone enters marriage and kind of thinks, well, I'm marrying this woman, but I'm still going to have my girlfriend on the side. And I'm going to continue seeing this other woman, during this marriage, and I don't see any problem with that. We would call that, so that's certainly a very extreme case, but that's a kind of, it's, that guy is going to be saying he's intending basically to commit adultery. But even more than that, when he said his vows, he wasn't really intending this to be an exclusive commitment with one woman. So that's what can sometimes happen in the cases of adultery. You're right. Adultery in of itself, while it might be a very valid reason for ending a relationship or maybe separating and maybe even getting a civil divorce to protect oneself and protect one's children, it's not what we would call like a ground for a marriage to be declared null or to receive an annulment, sometimes what people say. But it could, this sort of lack of fidelity, what they would say in Latin is, partial simulation, contra bonum fide, or simulation against fidelity, could come into play in that situation. The other thing that can happen too is that, not to go off too much on annulments, because as I said in the beginning, I wasn't just going to talk about dead marriages here, but it's also, there might be the possibility that maybe when both persons were saying their vows, they really did intend this to be like a lifelong exclusive partnership, but maybe there was something holding that back. Maybe there was like a deep-seated mental illness or extreme alcoholism that really impaired their ability to kind of live out this commitment. So not so much, so they maybe wanted to be married, they wanted this to work out, to be a lifelong commitment, but maybe there was just something going on behind the scenes that made this, maybe not only difficult for them, but impossible for them. So, I don't know. So we can talk a little bit more about that as we go along, but does that make sense? Yeah. So, but kind of this 1050, yeah, so this, first canon here I put, so it's between one man and one woman. It's an exclusive partnership for the whole of life, so it's a lifelong commitment. The commitment doesn't go beyond death, so you're no longer married if the other person is dead. And it's ordered by its nature to the good of the spouses. So it's, and this is a point, this was something that was kind of not always in the canonical tradition. This kind of came more out at the time of the Second Vatican Council, but kind of stressing if a man is marrying a woman, he's marrying her to be his wife, not to be like his live-in maid or to just basically take care of him or something like that. This is as much for her good as it is for his good as well. So there's kind of an equality there between the man and the woman. So it's ordered for the good of the spouses, not to make the other person's life a living hell. It's not for that. It's for the good of both of them. And then also for the procreation and education of offspring. Now, we don't say that everyone that's married has to have, children for it to be a valid marriage, right? Because we let older people get married who are beyond childbearing age, and, obviously biology probably won't, allow say 2 7-year-olds to have a baby usually. There can be miraculous exceptions to that, but in general, that's not going to happen. But what this is talking about here is that when someone is saying their I do's, they're committing themselves to this exclusive lifelong relationship that is open to children. And it doesn't mean that, you have to have a certain number to be, the marriage to be real or anything like that. But there just needs to be an openness to children and follow, and with that, we would also say, people should, follow what the church teaches on, marriage and family when it comes to spacing of children and all that. But what this is kind of concerned here with is like an openness to children. If someone enters a marriage and kind of says, I'm going to use contraception 100% of the time, and if we get pregnant, we're going to get an abortion. That's not what the Catholic Church means by being open to, the procreation and education of children. So that would be another kind of way that marriage, like even though these people might be saying like I do, they don't really mean marriage in the same way the Church understands it. So those are kind of, so I think it's a really good, there's a lot to unpack there, but that's kind of what the Church understands by marriage. And it's also, in 1b there for Canon 1056 talks about the essential properties of marriage being unity and indissolubility. So especially the indissolubility piece, we don't, like the Church teaches that civil divorce doesn't end, a marriage. Just like kind of walking off and leaving, your wife or something like that doesn't end the marriage. I mean, it might end the common life, but we believe that marriage is indissoluble, meaning it can't just be, you can't just break it up by your own choice. But we'll probably at the end of this, we might get a little bit into what does indissolubility mean, and are there exceptions to that, or is it a little more complicated? But we'll save that for a little later on.
Just like to ask about the indissolubility. A lot of Catholics are marrying Protestant, and the Catholic will marry, let's say the Catholic is a male and the female is Protestant, or marrying the Protestant church. And then at some point they want to come and have a blessing validated in the Catholic Church. So does that, what's the criteria for them to become, to be recognized in the Catholic Church? As far as
Yeah, so it's like, so they initially had this marriage that wasn't in the Catholic Church. And one, at least one of the people was Catholic, but the other one maybe wasn't. Yeah. And this is something that I think we encounter a lot, and I think in our parishes we encounter a lot, like, where maybe people, decide they want to have the beach wedding, and that's like the most important thing. But maybe at some point later, they're kind of like, I really want to have my marriage recognized in the Church. And so from the perspective of the Church, in a way, even though these people have been maybe, let's say they've been living together for a long time, maybe many years, they've been civilly married, maybe they have children, could even have grandchildren, right? But from the perspective of the Catholic Church, they're not married, but they can still, they approach the priest, they say, I want to get married in the Church, and they'd basically do everything you do like you would with a couple that's 22 and wants to get married. It might be modified a little bit because of like the people's state of life and stuff like that, and their life experiences. It might be necessary for the priest to kind of modify the program a little bit for formation. But they would do, they could have a small wedding or have a huge wedding with a, mass in the church. But from the perspective of the Catholic Church, they're getting married for the first time. So even though they maybe were living together forever and, it's Mr. and Mrs. Jones, from the perspective of the Catholic Church, they're not married until they have their marriage celebrated either in the Church or with the permission of the Church. So if that makes sense. Yeah. So I think we might be at a good point. I think we usually take a bit of a break. But any last, or sorry, go ahead.
What you were saying about the church emphasizing the establishment of families, and so the church calls it the holy sacrifice of matrimony. Did I get that right? Holy matrimony, the mass of holy matrimony. And doesn't the word matrimony come from the Latin root mater, meaning mother?
I think you're probably, yeah, I think you're probably right. It does seem like it would be like mater, matri, yeah. It's, I mean, it's certainly this is a means for people to be sanctified. And this is how most people, we talk about vocations. I think, was it last week you maybe talked about holy orders? That's a very specific way that some men are called to kind of live out their vocation to holiness, is by, say, ordination to the priesthood, ordination to the diaconate. But, that's only it's kind of a very small subset of the population, right? It's, most people have been called by the Lord to marriage. And it is, I think that holy matrimony, I think it's a beautiful way of putting it, because it is a holy institution. It is a means by which God can lead the man and woman to greater holiness, together. And I think that it's, my emphasis sometimes is, kind of looking at, sort of the strict legal categories of stuff. We spent, a lot of time talking about valid, invalid, sacramental, non-sacramental. But it's certainly, there is so much here. This is the means by which most people on earth, and certainly most Catholics, have been called to live their lives. And this is how they're called to come closer to Jesus, to kind of imitate him better and more closely, is by being married, and by, if God, gives them, to give, raise children, So I think it's, I think it's a very good and holy thing. And all vocations, there are different ways of looking at vocation. Some, would kind of say, well, a religious vocation is a higher calling, and there is a sense where that is true. It's a very unique and special vocation. But those of us who are married, we are called to holiness in the sacrament of marriage. All right. I think we can maybe take our break for, what was it, 10 minutes or something? So I think we covered, I don't know, a lot of material kind of before the break. Does anyone have any questions before we go a little further in, or? Okay.
What percentage of annulments are approved?
That's a very good question. Because if you probably ask some, American dioceses, especially 20 years ago, they would have said something like 100%. But there's a real catch to that. What there would be sometimes, in different places, kind of approach it in different ways. You have to remember, most cases that are coming to us, like some of these marriages, unfortunately, a lot of them were real train wrecks to begin with. A lot of the marriages I see are not pretty at all. So that's one thing to put in perspective. The other thing is that sometimes even these tribunals that would say they, every case that went through to the end maybe was an affirmative or, declared null. What might have been sort of unsaid is that there might have been a certain percentage, I don't know how many, 5%, 10%, it could have been even more, maybe where they might have started the process and kind of said, you know, there really isn't anything here. Why don't you just, you know, kind of back out of this, and we'll just maybe keep this on file, and maybe if something changes along the line, you know, maybe if your ex-wife, you know, chooses to participate and gives us some more information, maybe we can reopen the case. So that's something they would maybe do, like they would kind of call it the pastoral negative, which I'm not sure if it really was pastoral, because sometimes if someone's going to the tribunal, there's some people, there are all sorts of different people that kind of approach us for the nullity process or annulment process. Some people, you know, the ink isn't even dry on the divorce documents, and they come to us right away because they want to know, will marriage in the Catholic Church be a possibility for me in the future or not? You know, sometimes, you know, people just want to know, like, can I, you know, should I really begin, like, you know, look for someone to date, or, you know, will it be possible for me to get married in the church again? On the other extreme, we have people who've, you know, been, you know, they were married in the church, divorced, remarried for like 50 years civilly, and they're like both, you know, like in their 70s now, and they kind of want to make things right before, you know, they reach the end of the road and, you know, kind of return to our Lord at the end of their lives. And so, you know, we kind of have both extremes there. Sometimes the thing that's difficult when the people maybe wait maybe a little too long, I would say, you know, if it's been 50 years, is that it might be, you know, one of the things that we require in the process is, like, we look for witnesses, we look for people who were around at the time of the wedding that can kind of give their observations and answer questions. You know, what was this couple like when they were dating? What was it like when they were engaged? What was, you know, what was going on in the wedding in the early years of the marriage? But if people wait, you know, like 50 years, there might be not many people left who remember the wedding or were there or whatnot. So that can make it very difficult. So I think that if you hear statistics saying, like, you know, it's, you know, 100% of annulments are granted, it might be where those sort of harder situations that come up where it's been, okay, but, you know, there isn't like a lot of information here. It's not to say that it's not possible that this might have been an invalid marriage from the beginning, but we just don't have the proof to do it, or to, you know, for the judge to come to an affirmative decision. So, and that's sometimes, not to just talk about canon law and annulments here, but basically what the judge is being asked in a marriage nullity case is like, is this marriage invalid because of this reason? And he can either answer it one or two ways, affirmative or yes, like with moral certitude, you know, I declare that this marriage wasn't valid from the beginning by this reason. Or the answer could be negative, that there's insufficient evidence to, or there's not enough evidence to prove this ground which has been alleged by, you know, one of the people. So it's for the cases we get. I mean, we definitely, in my time, I've only been in the tribunal here for 4 years, but we do have cases that are sometimes go negative. I don't really know the percentage offhand. I think there might be a few more that are, quote, affirmative, but it's like I said, a lot of times the marriages that are coming to us, you know, were very, there were a lot of issues, a lot of problems, you know, so it's, you know, so for my colleague to say, you know, he does autopsies on dead marriages, you know, it's kind of from that certain mindset, you know, a lot of times the marriages we would get would be really ugly ones, unfortunately. I don't know if that helps. So a little bit, I mean, just a tiny bit, this isn't going to be too much here, but, about like the kind of, I mean, maybe to call this a history of marriage or the development of marriage is a little, I mean, I'm just going to say a couple words here, but I think just to kind of put it in the context of, what we do today as the church in marriage, because like I said, I mean, people have been getting married for a long time, and, even before our Lord came on earth, 2,000 years ago, people were having children and getting married. So, so it's, and I kind of have like a couple things from the catechism here, that it's, certainly we know that, so this is paragraph 1604 of the catechism. God, who created man out of love, also calls him to love, the fundamental innate vocation of every human being. For man is created in the image and likeness of God, who is himself love. Since God created him, man and woman, their mutual love becomes an image of the absolute and unfailing love with which God loves man. It is good, very good in the Creator's eyes, and this love which God blesses is intended to be fruitful and to be realized in the common work of watching over creation. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it. So we have a little Genesis there. This is like this is the way that God kind of intended it from the beginning, that, he asked, really man and woman to be fruitful and multiply. And this is how we live that out, is in marriage. But of course, original sin had to kind of get in the way of this. So again, this is another paragraph from the Catechism 1607. According to faith, the disorder we notice so painfully does not stem from nature of man and woman, nor from the nature of their relations, but from sin. As a break with God, the first sin had for its first consequence the rupture of original communion between man and woman. Their relations were distorted by mutual recriminations, their mutual attraction, the Creator's own gift, changed into a relationship of domination and lust. And the beautiful vocation of man and woman to be fruitful, multiply, and subdue the earth was burdened by the pain of childbirth and the toil of work. So that's kind of, sin comes into the world. God has his plan, for marriage and family, but kind of a wrinkle is kind of thrown into it with original sin, with the fall. But God's is there for us, and and I think, as we're talking about before, particularly in the sacrament of marriage, that's why it is a really good thing, and it's a really important thing to have, to not just, especially for us Catholics, is to get married and to, if we're in a relationship, to be strengthened by those graces that come from God to live out this commitment, because it's a very difficult thing to try to do on our own, to just live with someone else. But really, to have those graces of the sacrament is going to help us to live this vocation. And all vocations can be very difficult, whether it's marriage, priesthood, being a religious sister, whatever one's vocation is. Vocations are hard, but with God's grace, we can have some help in that. So that's kind of where it goes. So come Christianity and our Lord and stuff like that, so the early Christians, they were living in a society where marriage existed. So I have this kind of a quote here from a Dominican priest who wrote about marriage, in the early centuries of the church. The church's concern for marriage has spanned its history. The earliest Christians lived in the Roman world. Although these early Christians followed civil customs and legal requirements for entrance into marriage, the inner morality was at odds with that of the pagan Roman society. Christians were asked to commit themselves to an indissoluble union and to mutual fidelity. The marital relationship was based upon the belief that it's because of its relationship to the welfare of society and the patriarchal family. For Christians, its value was intrinsic. Another important difference between the two concepts of marriage was the fact that Christians believed that the spouses were spiritually equal. So there is like kind of this, Christianity comes on the scene, and, kind of see that, really basic, there's a complementary relationship between the husband and the wife. The wife isn't the property of the husband. She's her own person created in the image and likeness of God. Like, she's as much a part of this marriage as he is, because he's the man. That doesn't make him better or greater, than the woman. So there's even in the early years, there was this kind of radical equality, really, between men and women. And it might not have always been lived out in society and stuff like that, but in its fundamentals, though, marriage was really seen differently by these early Christians than, say, the Roman society they were in. Fast forward a bit to the Middle Ages, we kind of get to this period of time where there was kind of this question about what marriage is, what makes the marriage. So there was one school of thought that kind of said that, to be married, for it to be a valid marriage, like we were saying earlier, you have to exchange consent. You have to say your I do's, and that makes the marriage. There was another school of thought, and I think it kind of came from the the Germanic tribes and stuff like that. And their perspective was that what really makes the marriage is consummating the marriage. So when the man and woman have sexual relations, that's it, they're married. So these were kind of these two competing visions. And then, it was kind of not settled until Pope Alexander III in the 12th century kind of brought these two visions of marriage together. So to kind of say, okay, yes, a marriage becomes a marriage. It's affected when the man and the woman say their I do's. That becomes a marriage. But consummation is also important too. It adds, I think, what do they have? How did they put it here? Absolute indissolubility was added when the marriage was consummated. So that was a word we kind of brought up a little bit before, but I'll leave you with that. We'll kind of, I'll leave that as a carrot to the end. We'll talk a little bit about indissolubility and absolute indissolubility. And then, kind of getting closer to the present moment, we have the Council of Trent in the 16th century. So that was kind of, we talk a lot about the Second Vatican Council that was in the 1960s, and then there's the First Vatican Council that was in the 19th century. But really before that, the last big ecumenical council was the Council of Trent. And this one kind of dealt with the ramifications of the Protestant Reformation. And kind of, things were a bit of a mess at that point in time, after the Reformation. But one real issue was something called secret marriages or clandestine marriages. And so this is a quote I have. There's this guy, Philip Reynolds. He's a professor, I forget where he teaches, but he has this book that's like this big called The Sacrament of Marriage. And I should have brought it here, but yeah, it's I haven't gotten through all of it, I must confess, but it's a thick tome, but it's a very detailed and a very good historical analysis, kind of talking about the development of marriage through the centuries in the church. But this is a quote from him. To illustrate the problems of clandestine marriages, medieval theologian Hugh of St. Victor outlines an especially hard case, which I shall refer to as covert prior contract. It will become the standard example of the hazards of clandestine marriage. Suppose that a man has married one woman by consent alone, and no witness is present, so there is no proof of their marriage. Then he marries another woman, and this union is public and formal and solemnized before the church. Her parents give the bride away, and the priest blesses the marriage. In due course, they beget children. What should the church do if the first woman contests the second marriage and asks that her husband return to her? So it's kind of like, so the issue they had with these secret marriages is that in that time, there was no requirement to marry in front of a priest and two witnesses. If I wanted to marry someone, I could just kind of go in the back room. I could say my vows, she could say her vows, and we're married. But it's kind of a hard thing to prove. Like, there weren't any witnesses around. We didn't, record anything. Like, it's kind of like my word only. And I think sometimes we have these situations where, maybe the guy was like, I think I'm kind of tired of this. I'm going to go and marry someone else. The wife comes back and says, well, no, but we're married. And it's like, well, okay, well, how can you prove that? Well, I was never married to you. So this was a real problem. And so this kind of led to the establishment of canonical form. And basically, it survives to this day, kind of like under number 3 here. So what we basically started in the Council of Trent with a couple tweaks along the way led to this, what we have now today. So only those marriages are valid which are contracted before the local ordinary, pastor, or a priest or deacon delegated by either of them who assist, and before 2 witnesses according to the rules expressed in the following canons without prejudice to the exceptions mentioned in a bunch of different canons. The person who assists at a marriage is understood to be only that person who is present, asks for the manifestation of the consent of the contracting parties, and receives it in the name of the church. So that situation, so the priest, sometimes people will say well, the priest marries someone. So from our theology and from how, especially as Latin Catholics, we understand it that the couples, so the man and woman themselves, are the ministers of the sacrament of marriage. The priest, when he's present, acts as an official witness and receives the consent in the name of the church. And technically, they assist at the marriage as opposed to, say, doing the marriage or marrying them, the couple. He assists at the marriage. So, and it talks about all these things, the local ordinary, pastor, priest, or deacon. So local ordinary, that's going to be your bishop, so that's like Bishop Dealey, or also vicar generals are also local ordinaries. So I don't know if any of you know Monsignor Mark Caron. He's a vicar general, so he's kind of covered in that. The pastor, so your pastor here is Father Seamus. And then you have the priest or deacon delegated by either of them. So if another visiting priest comes and wants to do a wedding, they need this special authorization or permission called delegation from Father Seamus to do the wedding. So if another, a visiting priest from Connecticut, just kind of went into the chapel tonight and did a wedding, but Father Seamus didn't know about it, and none of the other priests here knew about it, that wedding would not be valid because he didn't receive the special permission or delegation from the pastor or if not from the pastor, from the bishop, from the vicar general. And in this diocese also, parochial vicars are also able to do marriages in the territory of the parish they're assigned. So the parochial vicar, so that's like, so those are the other priests who work under the pastor. So that's canonical form, and this only obliges if, kind of on the back here, part D, Canon 117, the form established above must be observed if at least one of the parties contracting marriage was baptized in the Catholic Church or received into it. So that's another thing. So, spent a lot of time talking about this requirement for marriage of canonical form only applies if a person's Catholic. So what if someone leaves the church? What if someone goes to an evangelical megachurch or something like that, or just stops, going to church altogether, and they get married on the beach? Is that person who used to be Catholic, would the Catholic Church consider their wedding on the beach in front of a civil notary a valid marriage or not? Just to throw out a question. No. Yeah, exactly. So because of this requirement, it's if they were baptized in the Catholic Church or ever received in the Catholic Church, even if they've stopped practicing, we have this principle that, like, once you're Catholic, you're really Catholic forever. You might not be a practicing Catholic, you might not be a good Catholic, but we would say even if, like, you don't darken the door of the Catholic Church and you say you're Protestant, or you become a Jehovah's Witness, whatever, from our perspective, you're always Catholic. So that's another situation too that sometimes we encounter, where like an ex-Catholic is married outside of the church, and maybe they decide to come back to the church, but they need to have their marriage celebrated in the Catholic Church because we don't recognize the marriage that they maybe celebrated outside of the church, even if that time they weren't practicing the faith at that time. So just talk a little bit about impediments to marriage. So impediments are these kind of requirements of church law. Some of them are based in divine or natural law, meaning that they really do kind of come from God himself. Others are additional things that have been added into, by the church, kind of like the requirement of canonical form. Like, that doesn't come from God. We believe that God has entrusted the church to, regulate the sacraments, including marriage, so can create these requirements. And there was a very good reason, saying because of, the secret marriages, the clandestine marriages in previous centuries, that there was a real reason to add this requirement of canonical form for Catholics to be married. But it's not something that comes from God himself. It's something that the church has the ability to change. But impediments are these reasons that someone who tries to get married, maybe it can't get married. So like, the first one that comes up is that a man before he's 16 and a woman before she's 14 cannot enter into a valid marriage. Now, it's going to be a little older here, and I think we recently changed our laws here in Maine, like civilly, like I think you have to be 18 to get married now. I think before it was maybe a little younger. But at least according to canon law, you can't get married. So a man can't get married before 16, and a woman can't get married before 14. So if they try to get married before then, or if they lie about their age, so they can get married or whatever, that would not be a valid marriage because of that impediment of age.
So people even nowadays want to get married to women?
It's funny you say that, because it's a weird, yeah, I mean, I think there are going to be cultures that are a little different. And I think that was part of the reason why I think maybe the state of Maine even raised the age up a bit, because as we've, as people from different cultures that maybe have different, kind of practices with that, and maybe have more younger people getting married and stuff like that, it does happen. But I think some time ago, I'd even heard of people calling the diocese, that live out of state, and they were looking to get their 16-year-old, wondering if they could get married in the Catholic Church in Maine or something. So it does happen. I mean, I think it's rare, but it can happen. But yeah, kind of a rare thing. Another, so this is kind of classic one too. So the bond, so a person bound by the bond of a prior marriage invalidly attempts marriage. So if you're already married, you can't get married. You can't, be bigamy, right? You can't marry someone else if you're married already. So hence, that's why people do go through the annulment process, because the annulment process looks at the marriage and says, okay, did this marriage exist in the eyes of the Catholic Church or not? And if the answer is that that marriage wasn't valid for some reason from the beginning, then there is no bond of marriage preventing someone from getting married. So that'd be prior bond, legamen. So that's an impediment. Another impediment here, this is one, a marriage between two persons, one of whom has been baptized in the Catholic Church or received into it, and the other is not baptized, is if a Catholic marries, let's say a Catholic woman marries a Jewish guy in the Catholic Church, that marriage would be invalid unless they receive a dispensation from the bishop from what's called the impediment of disparity of cult. So normally, if you want to say the ideal is that really in marriage, we would say that really, because one's faith is a very important thing, and one of the real purposes of marriage is passing on the faith to one's children. It's not impossible, but it is perhaps more difficult when the person you're married to doesn't share your faith. So the ideal would be for all marriages, I guess, of Catholics to be two Catholics getting married together. But the Church does allow Catholics to marry non-Catholics, whether they're baptized or unbaptized. But specifically, if they're unbaptized, they require this special dispensation from the impediment of disparity of cult, or otherwise, even if they exchange their consent in church in front of a priest, it won't be a valid marriage. So that's called the impediment of disparity of cult. I mean, this is why, there is kind of the paperwork the priest will do when someone is engaged and looking to get married. These are the sort of things that's why all these questions are asked, to make sure we catch stuff like this. But if it wasn't caught, if it wasn't figured out, then it would be an invalid marriage.
Or like, this is the priest's worst nightmare.
But it's.
We have a lot of destination weddings. So say you have a couple that's coming in from out of state. Now, thankfully, the tribunal reviews all of the marriage vows coming in from out of state. But say they're doing their marriage preparation in another diocese or another parish, and then they send the packet and they didn't get the dispensation from their bishop. And the thing shows up and maybe you didn't even get the file until really late. Some of the previous things would be like, thankfully this is not the case as much now. It's a pretty well-oiled machine. But in the past there have been circumstances, or somebody just forgot or didn't get it done or forgot to nail it in or whatever the thing was. Every once in a while, Father Jack or Monsignor Karen, or the bishop, somebody, so anyone who's has the authority to grant that dispensation, every once in a while they do get a cell phone call to say, I'm going into this wedding and I need a dispensation. And that's not a nice place to be, but every once in a while it does happen.
It does happen.
Oh, man. Oh.
Yeah, so it can happen. This is another impediment, and this is one we would say that comes from natural law. This is not something that can be dispensed. Antecedent in perpetual impotence to have intercourse, whether on the part of the man or the woman, nullifies marriage by its very nature. So the ability to be able to complete the sexual act as a married couple is absolutely necessary to enter into marriage. So if either the man or the woman isn't capable of having relations, then it can't be a valid marriage. So sometimes this comes up, this can be a difficulty that sometimes comes up when, I'd say in the cases where people maybe have, remarried, and they've been remarried for 50 years and they're like 80 years old and they want to have their marriage celebrated in the church. And then, we kind of do some investigation and, they kind of say, well, I'm not able to have, sexual relations anymore. And this is a really hard thing for, for whether it's for the tribunal or for priests or deacons to encounter. But really, if someone is in that situation, they cannot validly enter marriage. So that's a hard one. But it also says that sterility doesn't nullify marriage. So we might have, certainly our older couples, maybe, they're beyond childbearing age, or if people have sterility, whether it's on the part of the man or the woman, that doesn't invalidate the marriage. But the inability to have sexual relations does invalidate the marriage.
That invalidates the marriage after they get married.
It means that if they tried to get married, it wouldn't be valid. So it means they could say their I do's and everything like that, but at least the way the Catholic Church views marriage, it would not be a valid marriage. It might be civilly valid, and also too that we have to remember that all marriages that are celebrated in the church are presumed valid until proven otherwise. So it's not that someone could just kind of say after the fact, even, well, my husband is impotent. Can I marry someone else now? Before that happens, it still has to go through the tribunal nullity process, and it will probably be easy to prove, maybe with doctor's notes and things like that, but it would have to go through a process, because whenever a marriage is celebrated in the church among Catholics, or really, say for non-Catholics, like any marriage that's celebrated, there's a presumption of validity, that it's presumed valid until proven otherwise. Let's see. Oh, those in sacred orders invalidly attempt marriage. So this so we all know that priests don't get married, right? That's the general thing. But we do sometimes have deacons who are married, right? So what happens if the deacon's wife dies?
He cannot remarry.
He cannot remarry because impediment of sacred orders. So it's a very, it's an important thing to, I think they kind of remind these deacons, or the men that are aspiring to be deacons, that if their wife were to die before them, they would be unable to marry again because of this. So basically, the rule, if you want to call it, is that a married man may become a deacon. He needs to have his wife's permission to do it. The bishop won't do it without the wife's permission. And also in the Eastern Catholic churches, there are married priests as well. But kind of the same sort of system. They have to have their wife's permission to be ordained, and they can only be, they can't marry after ordination. So if their wife predeceases them, they cannot marry. Or even if they were to go through like a marriage nullity process, and like that marriage was declared null, they would not be free to enter into a new marriage because they have the impediment of sacred orders.
Here's an example. I mean, it may be a little humorous at this time. When I was 12, my favorite priest, my favorite sister, nun, left and got married.
Yeah. So it can happen. Like the church. So it's kind of a thing, because human nature is what it is. There is the possibility of, priests who have made, a commitment to celibacy for life can ask the Holy Father to, again, the word dispensation comes up again, to be dispensed from the obligations of sacred ordination, including celibacy. So this is something that can happen. I've known a number of gentlemen and encountered some in my work, particularly those who were maybe ordained in the 1960s, who literally said when they were going through seminary, the perception was, well, everything's changing, priests will be allowed to marry sooner or later. I can get ordained now and I'll be able to get married in, a few years when the Pope changes it. That never happened for these guys. But it does kind of, you can kind of say, well, you did promise something, maybe you should have not gone ahead with it if, you're making this promise. But there are perhaps valid reasons, and just some of them come from the fallen human nature, that the church does allow men who've been ordained to the priesthood or the diaconate to be what they sometimes call being laicized, or it's not the official term. We would say the loss of the clerical state is how it kind of officially is worded. We used to say reduced to the lay state, but that is, we no longer say that because it kind of implies this idea that, well, now they're going to be reduced to being lay persons. And it's not, in a way, it's not accurate, because we believe that ordination imparts a character ordination imparts a character like baptism. Like baptism, it's a permanent thing. You're configured to Christ. And also the priest or deacon who's ordained, it's a permanent character, but they no longer practice it, if you will, or exercise that ministry. So even the laicized priest still has the obligation to hear confessions of those in danger of death. So if he's in the situation where there's someone that's dying, he has permission from the church, and actually not only the permission, but the obligation to make himself available to hear the confessions of dying people if he happens to be in their presence. So, but that's kind of another thing. But so sacred orders, it's an impediment. So in the case of those priests who have gone about it, received permission from the Pope to leave the clerical state, they are usually also given permission to be allowed to marry. And that's especially since this pontificate under Pope Francis, that's something that's granted 100% of the time now, that almost every priest that's laicide is allowed to marry. And that was not the case even as recently as Benedict XVI. So that's kind of a change.
After the marriage, can they celebrate Mass?
No, they could do it because they're still a priest, but it wouldn't be lawful. It wouldn't be. They would not be authorized to do it. But right, if a laicized priest says Mass, it's still going to become the body and blood of Christ, the Eucharist. But he does not have permission or authorization to do it. So it would be unlawful, it'd be sinful too, to do that, but he could. So that's kind of so that's the impediment of sacred orders. And there's also things too that consanguinity is another thing. So I can't validly marry my mother. There's no way. You can't do it. And so that's like considered the direct line. I can't marry my daughter. Can't do it. I can marry my first cousin if I have the permission of the church. But without that permission, without a dispensation from the impediment of consanguinity, that would not be valid. Like, say, marry my first cousin.
Not 7 generations?
What was that?
It's not 7 generations?
There is a change. Yeah, under the old Reformed canon law, I think it did go further out. Now you only need a dispensation from, like, say, first cousin or aunt or uncle. I mean, kind of weird, but I mean, I wouldn't want to go there, but it is theoretically possible. But it might not be legal in your, in the civil jurisdiction too. Like, I think cousin marriage is legal in the state of Maine, but you need to get like a doctor's note and genetic counseling and stuff like that before the state will let you do it. But from the canon law perspective, you can do it, but you need a dispensation. So that was one of the ones I remember I got a request for. That was like my first time alone in the office. When I started, I got a call from a priest, and he's like, I need a dispensation from impediment of consanguinity. And I was like, okay, wow, this is weird. And that's sort of a weird thing too, is that, how far does the ability of the church to dispense from this go? There was a case under Pope Paul VI where there was a brother and sister in Korea who were married for many years, and then they realized that they were brother and sisters. And allegedly, I mean, there's documentation you can find where basically Pope Paul VI allowed a dispensation in that case. But that's about the only example I've ever found of that, and I had a professor of canon law said that issue hasn't been re-examined by any more recent popes. But I suppose if you think about it, it might not be. I mean, it's certainly kind of weird or whatever, but I guess, if we go back to Noah and the flood, and yeah, I guess there were brothers and sisters. Yeah, I don't know. It's just kind of a weird thing, but it's not one that many church authorities have wanted to re-explore.
I wonder actually if we're going to see more of this because of all the way that people are using in vitro and things.
Yeah.
They may very well end up marrying someone and they don't realize that the person actually has the same genetic father or mother.
Right, you bring up a very valid point. Yeah, so that's sort of a weird thing. There's also, there are a couple others, but say also legal relationship too, like, by adoption, that could also add in the same sort of impediment as well, even if I adopt, was it like Woody Allen, right? He married someone he adopted, right? And so at least in the Catholic Church, that couldn't be a valid marriage. You can't, so whether it's your natural child or an adopted child, I can't marry my adopted daughter. Like, that's not allowed, at least according to the Catholic Church. So I think kind of wrap up here with a little bit about, I guess, the pastoral care of people whose marriages have broken up. So the first thing that the church wants to do if someone says they're having a problem in their marriage is we want to help them save their marriage. And this doesn't mean people staying together if there's an abusive situation or things like that. No, people should definitely, in an abusive or bad marriage situation, they should get into a safe place for them and their children. But the first inclination for pastors of the church is to kind of want to help people remain married. But if things have kind of totally broken apart, people have gotten civilly divorced and there's no possibility of reconciliation, then that's the point when maybe someone would approach me at the tribunal and say I'd like to have my marriage studied for an annulment process. So in addition to the annulment process, so that process looks at a marriage and says there's something missing from the beginning, and that made it not a real or valid marriage, at least the way the Catholic Church understands the marriage. There's also two other possibilities for a marriage to be, I guess you could say, to no longer be an obstacle for someone to marry in the Catholic Church. And one of them is called the Pauline privilege. And so that comes from, I should have given it to you on this sheet of paper, but I didn't, but it comes from 1 Corinthians 7, 10 to 15. To the married I give this command, not I but the Lord, that the wife should not separate from her husband. But if she does separate, let her remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. To the rest I say, and I and not the Lord, that if any believer has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. And if any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy through her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such a case, the brother or sister is not bound. It is to peace that God has called you. So St. Paul here is talking about the situation where we maybe have two people who are, non-Christians. They're married. And one of them decides to become a Christian, gets baptized. But then the other person isn't interested in staying in this marriage anymore and leaves. What St. Paul is saying here is that that person, the one who kind of became Christian, became baptized, is not bound by that marriage. So, how that works today in the Catholic Church is it's very much, it might be the same as people that come to us for the regular declaration of nullity process. But, and a lot of times these are people that are in the RCIA program. They're looking to become Catholic. And what we'll do is, say if we have, a Muslim woman who's becoming, wants to become Catholic, her Muslim husband, left the marriage, and, she wants to be baptized. What the church will do is contact the Muslim man and ask him a couple questions. One, would you like to be baptized? And two, if you don't wish to be baptized, could you live without offense to the Creator with your wife who's now baptized? Now, if he has no interest in living with her, no interest in being baptized himself, or like in modern day, what it might be, we might send something to his address, we send it certified mail, he doesn't respond to us, he doesn't really care. That woman is once she becomes baptized and becomes a Christian, one is free to enter into a new marriage which will dissolve the previous natural marriage she was in. So that was something I spoke a lot about, was like indissolubility. Like, marriage isn't something you can just break up. Like divorce doesn't, divorce might be the civil dissolution of a marriage. But the Pauline privilege here is the church, or the way the church teaches, really from St. Paul, that the baptism, the conversion of this new Christian and her marriage now to another Christian can dissolve her first marriage, the natural, non-sacramental marriage she had to her, Muslim husband. So it's sort of a strange thing. We talk about marriage as being indissoluble, but there are sometimes it can be extrinsically dissoluble, and it always the faith always has to be involved. So this is a very particular case. So this doesn't apply in all situations. In places where Christians are minority, in say in Africa, parts of Africa, certainly a lot of Asia, these might be very common. Less common in the West and in the United States, but they do happen occasionally. Another kind of dissolution is called the Petrine privilege, or really more properly, the favor of the faith. And this is what we believe is that the Pope, the Holy Father, has the ability to dissolve non-sacramental marriages in favor of the faith of a Catholic party. So it's similar to what I talked about, the Pauline privilege, about a person who's converted to Christianity and like the non-Catholic spouse is not interested in Christianity. But this one, it is a little, it's not as connected to necessarily the conversion of the specific party, but it can also apply in cases where, say, a non-Catholic maybe is now divorced, wishes to marry a Catholic, and this marriage, this first marriage of the non-Catholic person was a non-sacramental marriage. It was just a natural marriage. That can be, so what we would do is we prepare a petition. Person would write to the Holy Father, Pope Francis, and ask Pope Francis to dissolve that natural marriage. And that's something that we, as Catholic Christians, we believe the Holy Father has the ability to do that, and sort of an extension, in a way, of the Pauline privilege, sometimes called the Petrine privilege, because the Pope is the successor of St. Peter. So it's kind of a very limited exception, but it is, those are the two cases where a marriage can be dissolved and not just declared null from the beginning, but a valid marriage, but a non-sacramental marriage can be dissolved by the action, either in the first case, the Pauline privilege, from basically the new Christian marriage of the converted Christian can dissolve the first natural marriage, or in the second case, it's actually the action of the Pope himself that dissolves a natural marriage. So that's something that, if people are looking to, you could say, marry again in the church, those are like the options. The first one is much more common. The last two, the dissolutions, are much rarer, but they do happen at times. So do we have any questions or thoughts? I guess before we can move on to the last, I think I understand we break up into groups, or usually?
Yeah, it depends on the week. Sometimes we end up going long, so if they have to put up with, I tend to go long, unfortunately, for them. But I think we haven't had too much small group discussion for a while, and we have a larger group than we had recently. So I think small groups would be great.
Okay, perfect. Does anyone have any questions before we go to the small group portion?
So what happens is husband and the wife, they got married in Catholic church, and his wife became Protestant, and he doesn't want to be Protestant, and now they're liberal. What would happen?
Yeah, so I mean, that sort of situation, so you have the two Catholics, they're Catholic together, but maybe one of them decides to become Protestant, but the Catholic person doesn't want to be Protestant, and it kind of leads to the breakup of the marriage. So this principle doesn't apply here. The way that I would have to go, or like the tribunal would have to go, if like the Catholic person were interested in entering a new marriage, we would have to go through the full declaration of nullity process to look at their marriage and to say, was there some reason that this marriage from the very beginning had an issue that made it not a valid, fully valid marriage? There are sometimes the heartbreaking cases we have where sometimes it's just people's poor decisions, maybe many years later, lead to the breakup of a marriage. It's not to say that it was invalid from the beginning. Maybe it was very much a valid marriage, but the guy, got interested in his secretary who was like 20 years older than, or 20 years younger than his wife, or, something like that. And it's unfortunate, but, there can be sometimes those hard situations. So it's like kind of your question before, it's not 100%. Not every case that comes to us is going to be, ruled as a null marriage meaning that people can, marry. So sometimes, that could cause a real strain in the marriage. Say one person wants to become Protestant or Jehovah's Witness or whatever, and maybe the marriage breaks up. It's not a guarantee that the marriage will be declared null and that the person will be able to marry again. There's no guarantee. We can't guarantee that.
The church bless a couple when the bride is pregnant.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly possible to get married, pregnant. I mean, I think especially in the past, sometimes people would speed things along because, someone, got pregnant and they're like, well, you should just kind of get married. And I think in general, now, I think the general recommendation now would not be to rush things. But certainly in the past, that was very common. And unfortunately, I mean, that's a lot of the cases have come to my desk are ones where people very hastily got married, maybe without really knowing the other person or anything. And just because, they didn't want to have the embarrassment of, a pregnancy outside of marriage.
Yeah, the danger, if somebody comes to talk to the priest about it, the danger is that one of the questions we ask them in that premarital investigation is anything forcing or pressuring you to enter this marriage against your will? And so if somebody is pregnant, it's the responsibility of the pastor to ensure that that person is not entering into the marriage when there's not if there's not a real desire to live, as David was explaining, the marriage needs to be for the good, for the benefit of the couple, right? It can't just be for the benefit of the child. And so if the person has no desire to live a married life with the other person, and is not intent on doing that, then it's a difficult, so you would hope that if they could make it work, they would. But there are actually, there are sometimes, as it was explained, a number of the annulments happen because of there's a sense of being forced or pressured by a pregnancy. So that's to be avoided.
It can be a factor, yeah, for sure.
But the church can bless a couple knowing that they are pregnant.
Well, by bless you means they can get married?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, if they're...
They could get married if they had 50 kids, or whatever, how many kids they had.
Yeah,
That's not an impediment.
It's not an impediment. I mean, it's really who can get married. It's really, assuming you're old enough, a man and woman who aren't already married can get married, And there is a sort of natural law right for marriage, because it's the way we're kind of built and designed and kind of part of God's plan. Marriage is a part of that. So, I mean, there might be reasons like pastorally, like a priest or deacon might suggest that, maybe you might need to look at things, before you get married. But at the end of the day, if there's no impediments, a priest or deacon can't stop you from getting married. I think it really pastorally, there should be kind of, the priest deacon should be kind of a voice of reason, help you to make the best decision you can. But if you're able to get married, he's able to get married, the church, really can't stop you unless there's like an impediment or some other reason like that. All right. And one other thing that always comes up, especially when I talk, sometimes I go to parishes and talk about the annulment process. And sometimes people wonder about children being legitimate or illegitimate. I don't know. So basically, it's, the idea is that, a child that's born outside of marriage is legitimate. And in some, I think especially in the past, this was kind of a bigger deal. I don't think a lot of people today even really think about it anymore. There might be, and actually when they were updating the Code of Canon Law in 1983, there was a discussion just to remove it altogether because there was a thought that it didn't really matter at all for modern civilization whether a child's legitimate or illegitimate. But they left it in because in some countries like Spain and other places, being legitimate or not affected inheritance according to civil law. So if they remove that there, it would kind of create that issue in those countries. But one thing that sometimes it's a reason that people feel like they don't want to petition the tribunal for an annulment is that they're worried, well, it will make my kids illegitimate if I go through with this. And that's not the case. What the church teaches is that if any marriage that's presumed to be valid, even if it's proven null later on, the children are legitimate because you acted in good faith. You thought you were married. Everyone thought you were married, even though it was maybe shown after the fact that there was something missing from this marriage. The children are still all legitimate. And it would be the same situation too, like your scenario, someone's pregnant and maybe they don't get married until a couple years later, like the kid's 2 or something. Once they do get married, say if they get married then the child is legitimized by the fact that the parents got married. So.
From the implementation of the canonical implications of marriages and the way it has to be handled. What we pastors are faced with is the many instabilities in marriages that you have. And that even the ones that are seemingly stable, they have lots and lots of problems within. So pastorally, it is very difficult when you listen to couples or listen to many people who get married after some years they are divorced, they want to get married, they have. So what do you advise as far as marrying is concerned? Because at the end of the day, it is about the instability is so much that most of the problems come out from from marriages and the family. And for the family, the institution is more or less unstable. So I don't know what would be advised with regards to the whole concept of going about marriage. The ones who are not getting married, those are pastors who are confronted every day with this bombardment of people coming over. My husband doesn't want me, I want to leave. What have you? Just a general question that.
Yeah, I mean, so, right, we have, I think it's, I kind of go back to, I think what I'd said before, I think it's the role of the church that if people are married, we want to try to do what we can to support them to try to stay married. It's, and I think it's going to be different, I don't know, I've never been, a priest, and looking for guidance and things like that. But, I think it's going to vary, I think, case to case, what to say to people. What I always say is, if there's a situation where there's any sort of real physical violence or things like that, especially if a woman is being beaten or anything like that, she should really get out of that situation. It's not, she's not I think it would be not right to ask her to remain in an unsafe situation, and her children. If there are difficulties, if there have been mistakes and things like that, I think we try to, as Christians, we try to encourage forgiveness. Sometimes people fall short. We encourage, people like, maybe forgive their wife for mistakes she made. Encourage the woman to, forgive the husband for maybe mistakes he's made. So I don't know. I think it's a really hard thing, and I wish I had the answers. I really don't. But it's I can say from my perspective, again, like my former departed colleague who would say that he does autopsies of dead marriages. I think one thing that sometimes really strikes me when we're asking people questions in the marriage annulment cases is like, we'll ask them, well, did you ever talk about finances before you were married? Did you ever talk about children? Was the possibility of divorce ever brought up? And sometimes people are like, no, didn't think about it. This was just the logical next step. So I think I would just encourage, people to communicate with each other and to kind of talk about these important and maybe hard issues, like, because, maybe the butterflies might not always be there, but, it's important, whatever stage of the game you're at, whether you're, dating, engaged, or whatever, to have, I think serious conversations about your future, because I think, if you don't talk about any of those things, you might be setting yourself up for a disaster. I don't know if that helps, Father. I don't know.
I'd like to also say that, I think your perspective is really good because it's an actual experience, but also that, that it's a sacrament. Marriage is a sacrament, right? Matrimony, and that there is an outpouring of the Holy Spirit, and that grace that gives that through the sacraments, helps us as couples, like my wife Deb and I, and us who are married, helps us to show that love of Christ in the church, so there's that part of it too. It's very positive and life-giving too, and I just want to emphasize that.
Yeah, from my perspective, again, it's the whole doing autopsies of dead marriages. Sometimes maybe focus a little too much on the bad, but you're right. I think it's important to also look at the good, and we here in this room even, but and certainly in our parishes, we see the example of so many wonderful married people and how loving they are and how beautiful it is, and so I think there's a lot to be said there, and that's why, we won't go into it tonight, but that's why I included some other things, like there's this exhortation for marriage that was that used to be in the old Roman ritual that I kind of included in the readings for this, and then also another prayer I really love. It's kind of, I gave you a copy of the Order of Celebrating Matrimony. So this is kind of an excerpt. There are actually a ton of options that aren't here. But if you have this, one that I really love is the nuptial blessing. So the marriage mass and the nuptial mass is a little different than your regular mass, is that after the Our Father, there's a special prayer that's said by the priest over the couple, and it's just, I don't know. I find this really nice. This was the one. There's, I think, like maybe 5 or 6 that can be chosen, but the one that's here, if you have this, like page 21 on this handout. That's I think it's just a very beautiful prayer, and this particular one has been used for a very long time by the church. It was used in the even today, like here we have the like Latin Mass community. is here. And so when they celebrate a nuptial mass, they use basically this blessing as well. So it's very old. It's been used for a long time, but it just kind of talks about marriage being strengthened by the Holy Spirit, and so I think it's very beautiful and good. So I don't know if would it make sense to break up into groups and.
I think that would be good. What time is it?
8:15.
8:15.
People want to do that, or do we, I don't know, are there,
Or is it easier just to do it as a big group, or?
yeah, maybe just, I do think kind of to the last, maybe just in terms of the discussion, maybe one piece to look at to Father Cyprian's, I think a lot of us are concerned, I don't know, you might know this too, David, the real decline in the number of people getting married. Not just in the church, but generally in society. And I think kind of speaking to Father Cyprian's point, when you have all of these people who their experience of marriage now, so many of them are coming from families that had divorce or were not healthy marriages, and you just hear a lot of people say, I'm not doing that. That's just a recipe for disaster and misery. And furthermore, I'm not going to have any kids. And I think, I think it's important for us to learn how to be able to say, well, no, it's worth it. Not only is it worth it, but it's needed. You can't have a healthy society without healthy marriages. You can look at study after study after study, and children need stable homes with their mom and dad. That's what helps children to thrive. Obviously, children are very resilient. They can always navigate all kinds of situations, but generally, we know that this is what is best for a child. But I think it's a very big concern. What is it now? I think half of children born today are being born outside of a marriage. So that means that their relationships with one or two parents are pretty significantly compromised. And I think that's a concern. It's something we're going to have to really pick up some pieces and try and help. And I think we're going to really have to try and help. We can't just, in the past it was like, well, let's do family ministry. And it's like, okay, here come all your mom and dad and the 3 kids. That's not parish life anymore. That is not what we have. We have mom with some kids, dad with some kids here. It's a whole bunch of things, and many times a lot of pain and a lot of challenges and a lot of struggle. And I think that's something we have to be thinking about as a parish. Like, how do we minister to everybody, make everybody feel loved, but at the same time say, this is really an ideal that we should be trying to aim for. If you haven't hit it, it doesn't mean that you're not loved, right? But again, this is always the tension with divorce and with marriage. Like, we want to really, and you hear it every time you preach about marriage, somebody who's been divorced is like, Father, what about all of us? It's like, well, true, that's important, but I can't neglect the good in order to try and heal and take care of the suffering. You got to do both, right? So I find this to be a pastoral challenge for sure.
What happens at the end of the annulment process if the annulment is denied and the person is not free to marry someone that they love? Does the tribunal work with them through that process? Does it become a pastoral thing? It seems like something that might be I'm walking away from the church now if it's not valid. So how what is the response to help someone through that?
Yeah, so I mean, kind of the role of the tribunal is really to focus on kind of the question, is this marriage valid or not? And if the determination of the tribunal is that there's no way that the invalidity can be proven here, first thing is that there is the possibility of an appeal. So in our case, our appellate court is the Archdiocese of Boston, so someone can say, like, I disagree with the decision made by the Diocese of Portland, and I'd like to send it to, Archdiocese of Boston. So the Archdiocese of Boston, they'll put 3 judges on the case, and so what they'll do is they'll take it first, so they'll take an initial look at the case, and if they think, okay, well, Portland's decision is completely correct here, they'll just confirm the decision, and then we're kind of in the boat where you're saying that, it kind of would really go to more pastoral care, in that case, how do I live my life now knowing that I'm kind of bound by this marriage that I'm no longer living and not free to enter into marriage. So it becomes like something that really, I think, is addressed locally and pastorally. But there is the possibility, like I said, of the appeal, like the appellate court could come to a different determination. They might just look at the facts differently, or maybe they might see it something in a different way than what we would say the court of first instance saw, and they might overturn the decision. So I've seen that before, where cases where maybe the Diocese of Portland has gone one way, and maybe the appellate court has gone the other way and overturned the decision. So that it does sometimes happen, but if all avenues have kind of gone and like the answer's been the same, like this is negative, there's not enough proof here to say like this marriage is invalid, then I think it really does fall. I mean, it's a hard thing, and I feel like we already give the priests a lot to do, but it becomes like kind of another thing, like how to help, guide people, really to kind of deal with this reality of like, I can't get married again. How should I live my life?
It can get very poignant because, and many times it's even before the annulment process. Someone may not even they may not want to embark on an annulment process because they say, well, I think I would validly marry. I remember a woman in my first parish. She had gotten married, and her husband had developed a really bad drinking problem, and he had left her, and she had 3 young children, and she wasn't particularly devout in her practice of the faith at the time. Hadn't really been practicing, and this very kind, generous Protestant man came into her life. They got married. She became Protestant, started going to the Protestant church, where they raised the children in the Protestant church. They were married for 30 years. And then she went to a Catholic funeral and had this reawakening of this desire to receive the Eucharist. But we had the issue of the fact that she was now living in a marriage not recognized by the church. And she, so that's where it's many times the priest is actually saying, look, I know you might think that it's a valid marriage, but there's a reason we have a tribunal.
Right.
Sometimes I have to convince them to undergo the annulment process because sometimes they might think, no, it was valid, and then you get in, they may not realize what their former spouse of the attempted marriage, like that there was a real lacking there, like that there was something that was really undermining it from the beginning, and that they may not even have been aware of it. I had a conversation with somebody, a couple another time recently, and I said, so you know, again, it was this question of whether an annulment should be. I said, well, why did you think, after you made all these promises, that you were no longer bound by them such that you could marry another person? What was your rationale? Right, like you said, better for worse, sickness and health. That's what you said. So how did you justify not following through with that? And she said, well, he left. And I said, so did you think that you were only bound as long as he stayed? Well, yeah. And I said, well, then you didn't understand what you were doing. And I said, that's grounds for annulment. Because you thought you were just going to be, you had to just be faithful as long as he was faithful. And if that was your understanding of what fidelity meant, then you didn't understand what you were entering into. And now there may be actually some reasons to investigate this. So sometimes this whole thing, it's, there are a lot of, there's a lot, we sit down, usually many times, I don't know how many of the annulments start with a pastor, but
Most do. Yeah.
most of them, there's a connection to a pastor or to a priest. And I think that's really important because the other thing is, how long do they take? They're not as long as in the past sometimes.
I would say from start to finish, you're looking at least a year, sometimes a year and a half, and that's assuming no delays. Like that you're getting your testimony in very quickly, and witnesses are getting testimony in quickly, but yeah, it's not a short process.
So, you think about just a year and a half of any process. You're going to want some encouragement and support along the way. And so, that's something that we try to make sure we're doing is encouraging people and helping support them. But there are times when, the longer you're in my position looking out at a congregation, the more there are some people who are living pretty heroically and carrying some pretty significant burdens. And it's really pretty remarkable how honorable and good people are, even when things fall apart.
Another question too about the dispensations. You mentioned the destination weddings. I'm not sure if I misunderstood. Are they getting dispensations to get married, like on an island somewhere, or are they getting dispensation to marry in the church after doing that?
It's kind of what it is.
And
Is
what
that
are the reasons to have a valid dispensation for
yeah?
getting married?
Sometimes the issue is sometimes when people are getting married, not where they live. So we have a beautiful cathedral here, and we get people from outside of state that want to be kind of married in Maine by the ocean and everything like that. So it becomes a matter of making sure because basically, so they want to get married, and the ceremony might be happening here, but they need to be prepared by their local priest, say if they're down in New Jersey or Massachusetts, wherever. And we have to make sure that all those, like say if it is like a situation, like if it's just two Catholics, there usually isn't going to be any issues with that. But if it's, say, one of the people in the marriage is maybe a non-Catholic, especially if they're unbaptized, you need to have that dispensation from the impediment of disparity of cult. Now, where it gets tricky is that the bishop that gives that has to be the one where the people actually live. And so just because the marriage is here, Bishop Dealey can't give that dispensation because the Catholic person who's getting married is not his subject, but is like, say, a subject of the Diocese of Massachusetts, for instance. So the paperwork, it has to be done there. The dispensation has to be done there. So Cardinal Sean, say for someone that lives in Boston, would have to grant it for them. That paperwork gets sent from the Chancery in Boston to the Chancery in Portland, And then we send the paperwork to the parish once everything is all checked out. So that can be, it adds another layer to it. It's like a little easier when everyone is in state and like in the parish. Like if Father Seamus is, assisting at the marriage of like someone who lives here, it's kind of easy to get everything together. But if they're from somewhere else and Father Seamus wasn't involved in their, preparation, there are more avenues for things to fall between the cracks.
It can get really wacky. I had in my previous parish, you'd appreciate this, I had they were students at University of Maine. So one had just become Catholic going through the RCIA, and the other was in the process of becoming Catholic, but was not yet Catholic, or she was thinking about becoming Catholic. She was Protestant. Both of them were children of Protestant ministers.
Wow.
And they asked, can we get married by our parents in our parents' Protestant church? And I said, I think so, right? With the proper dispensations. So, what they needed, they needed a dispensation, or they needed a permission for mixed religion, because it's Catholic marrying a non-Catholic. So that's a permission. Then they needed a dispensation from canonical form. That means they don't have to get married in a Catholic church. They could be married in a Protestant church. And then they needed a dispensation from place. Then I needed the permission of their pastor, of the Catholic pastor in the town where the Protestant church was, to give permission. So anyway, the whole thing was the thing, I was ready to pull my hair out. But we made it happen, it worked, and what's interesting is people often think getting married in the church means physically getting married in the church. No, it doesn't mean that. You can get married in a Protestant church, and we can recognize it as a Catholic wedding, right? It can be a valid, sacramental, if they're both baptized, marriage in a congregational or Episcopal church, right? So it's not, when we talk about, so that's important, people don't always get that. But that's where, a lot of this, you have to be smart to work in the tribunal because it is one of the most complicated things. And if you don't do it every day... Well, it's easier, we are doing it every day, so it does make it easier. But especially getting to Petrine and Pauline privilege, I'm like, what the heck were the rules for that? Because it doesn't come across your desk but every few years, maybe. So you just don't see it very often. Yeah. And some of the other kinds of things are challenging to just navigate and remember. But I think this is part of why, if you advise any couple who's thinking about marriage or has got questions about a marriage, annulment, or whatever, just have them meet with the priest. Because that's the best thing, is just to sit down and talk. Because if they go online, they're going to find all kinds of wackadoodle stuff. And they could call the tribunal, I don't know. You're always welcome to call. The tribunal is very knowledgeable. And if I don't know what I often am calling the tribunal too. So, we're trying to help, right? I mean, that's the whole thing here. But we're trying to make sure we help people without damaging families and damaging the goods that marriage is meant to protect, right?
So people just say they have a lot of process, that's why they don't want to get married. But if they have in the school, if they teach them how to go there, like this.
Well, part of this for me is if you go and buy a car, it's going to take you a little bit of the process. Sometimes people can be really kind of unreasonable about this. We just had somebody call in today. What was the request, Avery?
About to be a godparent, you mean?
Yeah, they're
they like want to be a godparent like in a month and they're not baptized. They were like, well, can I just get baptized and then I can be the godparent?
And so we were like,
I was like,
bring out the water and the chrism. But, it's like one of these things where sometimes people just don't, it's like, this is a major thing you're doing. It's not the kind of thing that you just like, I'm gonna, So.
But yeah, no, we're always happy to answer questions in the tribunal. I mean, usually it's priest deacons and, staff members in parishes that are calling us. But if you ever encounter something, you're always welcome to call us.
How quick are the dispensations turned around?
Those are quick.
Those are quick, yeah.
Because they don't need to be signed by the bishop. He's, the staff in the
You've
tribunal.
been delegated the authority. So in some dioceses, the bishop might have to sign them himself, but here it's not the case.
Are there standards that the bishops need to apply to grant a dispensation, or is it?
There are some.
Will?
Yeah, so like, say for instance, like for the impediment disparity of cult, one thing that has to happen as part of it is the Catholic party has to promise to do everything in his or her power to raise the children, if there are children that come out of the marriage, to raise them Catholic. And the non-Catholic person has to be informed that the Catholic party has made this commitment.
I just had a couple swallow hard over that.
Yeah.
Because she was a practicing Episcopalian, and he's not so practicing Catholic. And so they said, but the question was and they were going to get, which church they're going to get married in. And so I said, well, what's your spiritual calling? Where are you going to go to church? And she was like, my church. And I was like, okay. Well, I said, we can still get the dispensations, recognize the marriage in the Episcopalian church. But this is the dispensation, here's the dispensation. And it included the disparity of cult questionnaire, which says he's going to do everything in his power to raise the children Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
He's like, well, I don't know if I'm comfortable signing this.
No.
So I was like, well, because that's the cliff, right? Because if he's not comfortable signing it, he's saying, I'm getting married outside of the church.
Right.
Right, so I'm meeting with them again. He's apparently ready to sign it.
Yeah.
But I think, and I said, you're going to do everything in your power. That doesn't mean, it used to be that we made the non-Catholic sign.
Right, we don't do that.
But now we're like, well, the non-Catholic doesn't have the responsibility. It's the Catholic who has the responsibility. So we make the Catholic sign. But the part of it is, he's going to do everything in his power. He's not going to, nobody can hold their spouse a gun to their spouse's head, right? I mean, obviously, you do what you can.
So why would someone want to be married in the Catholic Church if they're not really practicing? Would it be pressure?
Yeah, parents.
Parents' pressure.
Parents, grandparents. Maybe also kind of some residual inklings of faith. And again, you would always want, as David was saying earlier, there's grace attached to the sacrament. So if we can help this person to avail themselves of the grace of the sacrament by the marriage being recognized, then I would make every effort to do so. I mean, that's where I try. Like, if somebody shows up at my door, I assume the Holy Spirit brought them there, and then the goal then is to try and help them to grow closer to God through whatever interaction we have, right?
Yeah.
Not to put up roadblocks or whatever.
Right, no, exactly.
But it can, sometimes I'm like, oh boy, what the heck in the world was the Holy Spirit thinking on this one?
What do you recommend to parents and grandparents whose kids have left the faith and they want to get married, and for them the church is not on their mind?
I don't know what your thought is on this, Dave, but from a pastoral point of view, I think sometimes people like, it's the thing like, can't get married outside the church. I'm like, well, okay. People like going to conniptions, their kids getting married outside the church. So, well, when's the last time your child went to church? Well, that's been years. They believe anything the church teaches. Very little. So then my thought is, well, okay, so it's not a venue, and grace is not, I think there's a danger of a parent really pushing, and the whole, I think the danger is that the kids can really kind of resent it. I think in some ways it's probably better not to push, because there's just no authenticity to it.
Right.
Like, to me, it's like, well, you don't believe it, you're not going. It's going to be kind of a show, and your guests are all going to come and be like, well, I guess their mom made them do it. And that's not, for me, it's to say, well, get married, do your thing, but the parents' work should be on helping them to see that they should reconnect with the church. And as they reconnect with the sacramental life, then if that desire kicks back in to reconnect with faith, then their marriage that's not hard, to bring the marriage back on.
Right.
Or to bring the marriage in. But if they don't have faith, then the question is, does it really make sense to stand before the altar of God? What's going on there? I don't know.
Yeah, no, I'm in agreement. Yeah, I think it's, I think you don't want people to be making a show of it. I think we want it to be a genuine, commitment. But it's hard. I think in the past there was real societal, pressure to get married in the church. Now it's almost the opposite.
Actually, we are right in the middle of a marriage preparation session. It's 5 sessions on Sunday afternoons. So this very room, actually, we have 13 couples that are meeting here. And I really think that if they're getting married in the church now, there's no pressure to get married in the church. There's really a lot. It's encouraging, because they're saying, yeah, we want to be connected we want our marriage starting on the right foot, close to God, we want to live our faith, we want to be doing these things. And so I think it's encouraging in that regard. So it's not all doom and gloom, there's some good things happening.
No, very true.
David, I know it's getting late, and whoa, 8:42, holy moly. Thanks so much for taking the time to be with us.
Yeah, thank you. Pleasure.